I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who kept a ledger of betrayals, but here I am at 78, tallying up the ways my own blood has tried to sell me down the river. My name is Beatrice Harlan, and I've lived long enough to bury my husband, outlast most of my generation, and apparently, overestimate the loyalty of family. They say the house chooses you, not the other way around, and this sprawling Victorian on Maple Street in Willow Creek has been my anchor through 52 years of storms, both literal and metaphorical. The house sits like a grand dame on 3 acres of what used to be prime farmland, her wraparound porch creaking with the wisdom of decades, ivy climbing her clapboard sides like nature's own embroidery. Harold and I bought her in 1973 with scraped-together savings from his shifts at Morrison's Mill and my late-night seamstress work that left my fingers pricked and my eyes strained but our dreams intact. Back then, she was a fixer-upper that the bank was eager to unload, foundation solid but everything else crying for attention. We gave her that attention, room by room, season by season, until she became the beating heart of our little world. The apple orchard out back still bears fruit, gnarled branches heavy with Honeycrisps and Granny Smiths that I tend with arthritic hands each dawn. Harold planted those trees the year Marcus was born, joking that our son would grow up strong as apple would. He did grow strong, but apparently not strong enough to resist the gravitational pull of greed when opportunity came knocking in the shape of real estate speculation. It's Marcus's boy, Tyler, who delivered the killing blow last Thursday evening as autumn light slanted through the kitchen windows like judgment itself. 26 years old, handsome in that careless way that young men wear like armor, he leaned against my granite countertop, the one Harold installed himself despite having only one good arm after the mill accident, and said with the casual cruelty that youth mistakes for wisdom, "Grandma, you're too old for this house." Too old. The words landed like a physical blow, stealing my breath the way a hard fall might. I stood there in my flour-dusted apron, the same one I'd worn to bake his birthday cakes for 2 decades, and felt something fundamental shift in the foundation of my world. Not the house's foundation, that's solid as bedrock, but the foundation of trust I'd built with this boy who used to chase fireflies in my meadow and beg for bedtime stories about his grandfather's logging days. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and I knew in that moment that this conversation would be the fulcrum on which everything else would turn. Because Tyler had no idea what he'd just stepped into, speaking those words in the kitchen where 3 generations of Harlans had made their plans and shared their secrets. To understand how we got here, you need to know where we came from. I wasn't always Beatrice Harlan of the Victorian house with the apple orchard. I was Beatrice Murphy, daughter of Irish immigrants who cleaned other people's houses and mended other people's clothes to keep food on our table in a tenement that smelled of boiled cabbage and broken dreams. My mother's fingers were permanently stained with bleach, her back permanently bent from scrubbing floors, but she taught me the most valuable lesson of my life: own something, Beatrice. Even if it's just the needle in your hand, make sure it's yours. I met Harold at a barn dance in 1969, him all gangly limbs and shy smile, me with my hair pinned up in victory rolls and dreams bigger than Willow Creek could contain. He was working at Morrison's Mill then, coming home each night covered in sawdust that I'd brush from his shoulders as we planned our future on the porch swing of his mother's boarding house. The mill accident in '89 took his left arm but not his spirit. If anything, it sharpened his focus. While other men might have wallowed in what they'd lost, Harold learned to design custom furniture with one hand that city folk drove hours to buy. We raised 2 boys in this house, Marcus, our steady firstborn who tackled life like a mathematical equation, and little Theodore, who passed at 7 from the fever that swept through town like a thief in winter's darkest hour. The grief nearly broke us, but this house held us together, her rooms absorbing our sorrow and slowly, gently, giving us space to heal. We planted Theodore's memorial garden where the old barn used to stand, and every spring when the daffodils bloom, I remember his laughter echoing through these halls. Marcus left for college and never really came back, not in any way that mattered. Oh, he visits for holidays and important occasions, but he left his heart in the city where success is measured in square footage and stock portfolios. He built himself into a successful sales manager, married Lila, a woman sharp as winter wind and twice as cutting, and had Tyler, their golden boy who was going to be everything they'd worked for. Lila measures everything in return on investment, from the organic groceries she serves at her Pinterest-perfect dinner parties to the relationships she cultivates like prize roses. She's all yoga-toned arms and calculated smiles, the kind of woman who can make you feel small without saying a harsh word. When she speaks to me, it's with the patronizing tone reserved for children and the elderly, as if my 78 years have somehow diminished my capacity for understanding the complexities of modern life. And then there's Tyler. God help me, I loved that boy with every fiber of my being from the moment he drew his first breath. He was the light that filled the spaces Theodore had left empty, a towhead terror who built elaborate forts in the apple orchard and listened with wide eyes to my embellished stories about his grandfather wrestling bears and outsmarting lumber barons. We'd spend hours in my kitchen, him perched on a stool while I taught him to measure flour and crack eggs, his small hands covered in mine as we rolled pie crust into perfect circles. But somewhere between adolescence and adulthood, the world chewed him up and spit out something I barely recognized. College was a disaster, too many parties, too little studying, and a complete inability to see consequences until they'd already arrived. He dropped out junior year with nothing to show for his education but debt and a vague sense that the universe owed him better. Then came the cryptocurrency phase, where he convinced himself he was going to revolutionize finance from his bedroom while losing every penny Harold's insurance policy had left him. The string of jobs that followed were like stepping stones across a river of disappointment: delivery driver, retail clerk, a brief stint selling insurance that ended when he realized successful salesmanship required actual effort. Each failure sent him spiraling deeper into resentment, as if the world's refusal to hand him success was a personal affront rather than the natural consequence of choices made and unmade. When he showed up at my door 18 months ago with a duffel bag and a sob story about needing to figure things out, I opened my arms and my home without hesitation. Just temporary, Grandma B, he promised, those blue eyes, Harold's eyes, wide with what I mistook for humility but now recognize as calculation. Temporary became 6 months, then a year, then a way of life that neither of us acknowledged was slowly poisoning the well of our relationship. At first, it felt like a gift, having young energy in the house again, someone to share meals with and talk to in the evenings. But gradually, like water wearing away stone, the dynamics shifted. The grateful grandson became the entitled houseguest, and the loving grandmother became the convenient bank account with a soft heart and poor boundaries. The transformation didn't happen overnight, poison rarely does. It started with small comments, casual observations that landed like seeds in soil I didn't realize was fertile ground for doubt. "This place is huge for one person, isn't it, Grams? You must feel like you're rattling around in here like a marble in a tin can." He'd laugh when he said it, that charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble since childhood, but there was something calculating in his eyes that made my stomach twist. The bills started piling up on the kitchen counter, his phone plan that somehow cost more than my monthly grocery budget, the high-speed internet upgrade he needed for his streaming career that never quite materialized, the subscription services that multiplied like rabbits in spring. "Just until I get back on my feet," became his favorite refrain, delivered with the practiced sincerity of someone who'd learned that remorse could be currency if spent wisely. I'd slip him cash from my modest pension, the same way I'd slipped him cookies when he was small and his parents weren't looking. "Don't tell your folks," I'd whisper, and he'd hug me with what felt like genuine gratitude but was probably just relief that the ATM was still dispensing. Harold's life insurance policy had left me comfortable enough to keep the lights on and the pantry stocked, but comfortable was a relative term when supporting 2 people on a fixed income. Then came the mysterious trips to the city, announced with vague explanations about networking opportunities and exploring investment properties. Tyler would disappear for days at a time, returning with stories that changed depending on who was asking and when. Sometimes he was consulting with realtors about market trends, other times he was meeting with potential business partners about ventures he could never quite explain in detail. The common thread was always money, how to make it, where to find it, and increasingly, how to extract it from assets that were currently tied up in unproductive uses. "You know, Grams, the land values around here have really shot up," he'd say over dinner, cutting his meat with the same methodical precision his father used to approach problems. "Developers are sniffing around properties like this one. Could be a real windfall for someone smart enough to capitalize on the trend." The way he said someone made it clear he wasn't talking about me. I was apparently too old to be smart about anything, let alone real estate speculation. The conversations grew bolder as autumn progressed. Tyler would spread real estate listings across my dining room table like battle plans, pointing out comparable properties that had sold for astronomical sums to developers who specialized in luxury residential communities. The Victorian houses that had once defined Willow Creek's character were being gutted and subdivided, their gracious rooms carved into profitable units that maximized square footage while minimizing charm. "Look at this one," he'd say, tapping a listing with his finger. "Same vintage as this place, similar acreage. Sold for $1.8 million to a developer who's putting in 24 condos. 24 grams. You could live anywhere you wanted with that kind of money." His enthusiasm was infectious in the way fever was infectious. It spread through the conversation until the very air felt heated and unstable. But it was Thanksgiving that really showed me where the wind was blowing. Marcus and Lila flew in from the city for their annual performance of family togetherness, arriving with expensive wine and patronizing smiles. The dinner table, which had hosted 49 Thanksgiving celebrations in this house, became a stage for what I now recognize was a carefully orchestrated campaign. Tyler dominated the conversation with his vision for maximizing the property's potential, his eyes gleaming like a prospector who'd found gold in the family mine. Lila nodded along with theatrical enthusiasm, her fork pausing midway to her mouth as she absorbed each detail of his presentation. "It's so forward-thinking, Tyler," she purred. "Really optimizing underutilized resources." Marcus cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze with the practiced skill of someone who'd learned early that eye contact could be interpreted as honesty or accusation, depending on the observer's perspective. "Mom, Tyler's got some interesting ideas. Good ones. We could all benefit from thinking outside the box." Benefit. The word tasted like ash in my mouth as I carved the turkey Harold had taught me to prepare, the same recipe we'd used for decades, the same tradition they were apparently ready to carve up along with everything else I'd spent my life building. After they bundled into their coats and called their rideshare to the airport, the house felt different, not empty, but violated somehow, as if strangers had been rifling through drawers and measuring rooms for purposes I wasn't supposed to understand. Tyler lingered in the foyer while his parents waited on the porch, their breath visible in the November cold that seemed to seep through the very walls. "Grams," he said, his voice dropping to the conspiratorial whisper he'd used as a child when asking for extra dessert, "you've got to start thinking seriously about your future. This house is beautiful, but it's a lot for someone your age. The stairs alone are a hazard. What if you fell and couldn't get help? And these winters are brutal. You're isolated out here." He gestured around the foyer with its original hardwood floors and hand-carved banister, as if the beauty that had taken Harold and me decades to restore was somehow evidence of impracticality rather than achievement. "There are these amazing assisted living communities now, Grams. Modern amenities, round-the-clock care, social activities. You'd love it. You deserve that kind of peace of mind. Too old. Hazard. Isolated. Deserve." Each word landed like a carefully placed stone in the foundation of doubt I hadn't realized was being constructed beneath my feet. But it was the word deserve that hit hardest, as if my 78 years of hard work, sacrifice, and perseverance had somehow earned me the right to be shuffled off to a facility where other people could make decisions about my daily existence while my family divided up the assets I was no longer competent to manage. "Think about it," he said, pressing a kiss to my cheek that felt more like a benediction than affection. "Just think about it." After the door closed behind them, I stood in my empty house listening to the familiar sounds that Tyler called hazardous, the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through windows that had weathered countless storms, the tick of the grandfather clock that had marked time for 3 generations of Harlans. These weren't the sounds of danger, they were the sounds of home. But something Ruth Davidson had told me 3 years ago suddenly echoed in my memory with crystalline clarity. Ruth, Theo's old school friend who'd become a sharp-as-a-tack estate planning attorney, had warned me over coffee and homemade scones about what she called vultures circling widows. "Family's family, Beatrice," she'd said, her eyes serious despite her gentle smile, "but blood doesn't always mean loyalty. Sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones you need protection from. I'd laughed then, dismissing her concern as professional paranoia. But now, climbing the supposedly hazardous stairs to my attic study where Harold's old roll-top desk held the papers that documented our life's work, I wasn't laughing anymore. My hand trembled slightly as I reached for the bottom drawer where I'd kept our most important documents safe from floods, fires, and apparently, family members who'd decided I was too old to understand their value. The leather folder in Harold's desk drawer felt heavier than it should have, weighted with more than just paper and ink. I spread the contents across the scarred oak surface where my husband had once sketched blueprints for custom cabinets and calculated lumber costs with the precision of a man who understood that every board had to count. The deed lay before me like a map to territory I'd forgotten I owned, its formal language as beautiful as poetry in the lamplight that cast long shadows across the attic room. Beatrice Murphy Harlan and Harold James Harlan, fee simple absolute. The words marched across the page in notary blue ink, dated September 15, 1973. No cosigners, no liens, no mortgages, just two names and a legal description of 3 acres that had become the foundation of everything we'd built together. The mortgage had been paid off by 1987, 2 years ahead of schedule, thanks to Harold's furniture sales and a small inheritance from his Aunt Millicent that we'd used to make the final payment instead of taking the vacation to Ireland we'd been planning. But it was the other documents in the folder that truly shocked me, papers I'd filed away and half forgotten in the fog of grief that followed Harold's passing. Bank statements from accounts I barely remembered opening, investment portfolios that Ruth Davidson had helped me set up 5 years ago when she'd sat me down for what she called widow-proofing my finances. Beatrice, Ruth had said over tea in my kitchen, her silver hair catching the afternoon light, you need to understand something about predators. They don't always come from outside the family. Sometimes the most dangerous wolves are the ones who know exactly where you keep the key to the henhouse. I'd thought she was being dramatic then, Ruth with her lawyer's tendency to see conspiracy where others saw coincidence. But she'd been insistent about creating what she called financial firewalls, separating assets, creating trusts, making sure that if anyone ever came after what Harold and I had built, they'd find the fortress better defended than they'd anticipated. Harold's patents had been the foundation of our unexpected wealth. 3 designs for logging equipment improvements that he'd tinkered with in the shed behind the house, modifications so simple and obvious that other people kicked themselves for not thinking of them first. The Canadian lumber company that licensed them had been faithfully sending quarterly royalty checks for 15 years, modest amounts that Harold had quietly deposited into a separate account he'd opened without fanfare or family discussion. $10,000 every quarter, I whispered to the empty attic, remembering the afternoon Harold had shown me the statements just 6 months before his heart attack. Not making us rich, but keeping us comfortable. Comfortable had turned into something more substantial when Ruth convinced me to invest the accumulated royalties instead of letting them sit in savings accounts earning pennies on the dollar. The investment portfolio showed a balance that made my hands shake, $847,000 in diversified index funds, real estate investment trusts, and municipal bonds. Ruth had been conservative but not timid, growing Harold's legacy with the same steady patience he'd used to nurture our apple trees. Between the patents, the investments, and the property's current assessed value of $1.2 million, I was sitting on nearly $2 million in assets. $2 million that Tyler, Marcus, and Lila assumed I was too old and addled to understand or protect. Ruth's business card was still tucked into the folder, her office number written in her precise script along with a note, "Call me day or night if anyone, and I mean anyone, starts pressuring you about this house or your finances. Trust your instincts, Beatrice. They're sharper than you think." I'd kept her warnings filed away along with the financial documents, but now they resonated like church bells on a clear morning. The conversations I'd dismissed as family concerns suddenly took on darker implications. Tyler's casual questions about my estate planning weren't casual at all. Marcus's phone calls asking whether I'd updated my will lately weren't expressions of filial duty. And Lila's suggestions about assisted living weren't motivated by genuine care for my well-being. They thought I was a confused old woman sitting on a fortune she was too senile to protect. They were half right, I was sitting on a fortune. But confused? Senile? Those assumptions were about to become the most expensive mistakes of their calculating lives. Ruth had taught me about evidence the same way she'd taught me about investments, methodically, thoroughly, and with an eye toward future protection. Documentation is your friend, Beatrice, she'd said during one of our planning sessions. People can lie about conversations, but they can't argue with recordings. At the time, I'd thought she was being paranoid. Now, her paranoia felt like providence. The first recorder was small enough to hide in the sugar bowl on the kitchen counter, a device Tyler had ironically recommended when I'd mentioned wanting to record family stories for posterity. "Technology's amazing these days, Grams," he'd said, showing me how to operate the voice-activated system. Crystal clear audio, hours of storage. He'd even helped me test it, never imagining that his own voice would be the first betrayal it captured. The second recorder found its home in the cushions of the porch swing where Tyler conducted his most sensitive phone calls, believing the outdoor setting provided privacy that indoor walls couldn't guarantee. The third went into the living room bookshelf, tucked behind Harold's collection of Zane Grey novels that no one had touched since his passing. Within a week, I had an audio surveillance network that would have impressed a private investigator. But it was Tyler's laptop that provided the most damning evidence. He'd asked to use my Wi-Fi password for job searching, and I'd given it to him along with permission to use the small desk in the guest room. What I hadn't anticipated was how careless he'd become about closing browser windows and clearing search histories. When he left the computer open one afternoon while running errands, curiosity compelled me to glance at the screen. The search history read like a manual for elder abuse: how to get conservatorship of elderly parent, signs of dementia in grandmother, legal ways to force sale of inherited property, elder financial abuse loopholes, and most chillingly, what to do when elderly relative refuses nursing home. Each search result had been carefully bookmarked, creating a digital roadmap for systematic exploitation. But the real revelation came in his email correspondence with a lawyer in Buffalo named Richard Clemens, whose website specialized in what he euphemistically called family asset protection services. The email thread stretched back 3 months, beginning with Tyler's initial inquiry about helping my grandmother make better financial decisions and evolving into detailed discussions of conservatorship proceedings and involuntary commitment procedures. The key, Clemens had written in one particularly cold-blooded message, is establishing a pattern of diminished capacity. Document instances of forgetfulness, confusion, poor judgment. Photographs of unsafe living conditions help. Does she leave burners on? Forget to take medications? Any evidence of self-neglect strengthens the case for intervention. Tyler's responses revealed the extent of his surveillance and manipulation. He'd photographed the cluttered surfaces in my craft room, describing them as evidence of hoarding tendencies. He documented the loose handrail on the front steps that I'd been meaning to have Harold's old carpenter friend repair, presenting it as proof of dangerous living conditions. Most insidiously, he'd begun testing my memory with trick questions, then recording my natural moments of confusion as symptoms of cognitive decline. The recordings from my hidden devices painted an even uglier picture. Tyler's phone conversations with Lila were exercises in cold calculation, their voices carrying the detached professionalism of business partners discussing a hostile takeover rather than family members expressing concern for a loved one. The doc says she's showing early signs, Tyler lied smoothly during one call, his voice drifting through the kitchen window from the porch swing. Forgets where she puts things, gets confused about appointments. Dr. Morrison thinks a professional evaluation would be appropriate. Dr. Morrison, my physician of 20 years, had said no such thing. Our last appointment had resulted in him complimenting my mental sharpness and physical resilience. Lila's responses were equally manufactured. Poor Beatrice. It's so hard to watch someone we love deteriorate like that. But Tyler, you're being so responsible, looking out for her interests. Marcus and I are proud of how you're handling this. Her tone carried the saccharine sympathy of a funeral director discussing burial packages. But it was Marcus's recorded conversation with Tyler that truly broke my heart. My steady, mathematical son, the boy who'd built birdhouses with his father and helped me plant the memorial garden for Theodore, had apparently decided that sentiment was a luxury he could no longer afford. Just get the deed, son. Marcus's voice crackled through the speaker with the authority of someone accustomed to closing deals. Once we establish conservatorship, the rest is paperwork. Real estate market's hot right now, we'd be fools not to capitalize. Get her into a nice facility, sell to developers, split it 3 ways. Everyone wins. Even Grams? Tyler had asked, and for a moment I heard an echo of the boy who used to worry about accidentally stepping on ants. Especially Grams, Marcus replied without hesitation. Professional care, no more worrying about maintenance and bills. She'll thank us eventually. The casual certainty in his voice, the assumption that gratitude would naturally follow betrayal, cut deeper than outright hostility would have. This wasn't malicious destruction, it was pragmatic exploitation, which somehow felt infinitely worse. Christmas arrived with the kind of heavy snow that transforms Willow Creek into a Courier and Ives postcard, the Victorians' gingerbread trim outlined in white like frosting on a wedding cake. Marcus, Lila, and Tyler descended on the house with the coordinated precision of a military operation, arriving with expensive gifts that felt more like bribes and smiles that never quite reached their eyes. The dining room table, extended to its full length with both leaves inserted, groaned under the weight of tradition and conspiracy. Lila had insisted on contributing the centerpiece, a modern arrangement of white orchids and silver branches that looked sophisticated and sterile against my grandmother's lace tablecloth. So much more contemporary than those old artificial poinsettias, Beatrice, she'd said, replacing my Christmas decorations with the casual authority of someone rearranging furniture in her own home. Tyler dominated the dinner conversation with what he called his vision presentation, unrolling architect sketches across the damask cloth like a general displaying battle plans. The drawings showed my beloved Victorian carved up into 12 luxury condominiums, the apple orchard replaced by a parking lot, the memorial garden paved over for a swimming pool complex that looked like something from a resort brochure. Look at the potential here, Tyler said, his eyes gleaming with evangelical fervor as he traced property lines with his finger. We keep the original facade for historical charm, but completely modernize the interior. Open concept living, granite countertops, stainless steel appliances. Each unit would rent for $3,500 a month, minimum. Lila leaned forward with theatrical enthusiasm, her wineglass catching the candlelight like a prop in a carefully staged performance. It's brilliant, Tyler. Really maximizing the property's earning potential while preserving its architectural heritage. The best of both worlds. Her use of business jargon at my Christmas table felt like sacrilege, reducing Harold's and my life's work to bullet points in a development proposal. Marcus carved the turkey with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else, his silence more telling than words. When he finally spoke, it was with the measured tone of someone who'd rehearsed his lines. Mom, this isn't just about money. It's about legacy. This property could provide financial security for generations of Harlans. Tyler's thought this through from every angle. Every angle except what I want, I said quietly, my voice barely audible above the clink of silverware and the whisper of settling snow against the windows. Tyler's head snapped up from his blueprints, surprise flickering across his features before being replaced by practiced concern. Grams, that's exactly why we're talking about this now, while you can still be part of the decision-making process. This house is beautiful, but it's becoming a burden. The maintenance alone must be overwhelming. Lila nodded sympathetically, reaching across the table to pat my hand with fingers cold despite the warmth of the room. Beatrice, darling, we've researched some absolutely lovely assisted living communities. Places with activities, social interaction, professional staff. You wouldn't have to worry about anything anymore. Her touch felt like ice against my skin, and I understood in that moment how snakes must feel when they shed their old skins, cold-blooded and utterly transformed. The Willows at Cedar Ridge has an opening in their premium wing, Marcus added, consulting his phone with the casualness of someone checking the weather. Two-bedroom suite, all meals included, transportation to medical appointments. It's actually quite reasonable when you consider the cost of maintaining this place. Reasonable. Premium wing. The clinical language stripped away any pretense that this was about my welfare rather than their convenience. They'd already picked up my cage and calculated the monthly rental fees, reducing my life to a line item in their financial planning spreadsheet. Tyler spread out more papers, photographs of contemporary condominiums with names like Heritage Point and Maple Crossing, developments that had consumed other historic homes in other small towns where other families had decided that progress mattered more than preservation. "Look at what Thompson developers did with the old Morrison mansion," he said, pointing to a glossy marketing brochure. "Completely transformed the neighborhood. Property values shot up 30% across the board." The Morrison mansion where Harold had courted me at Sunday socials, where we danced to Glenn Miller records while planning our future, now existed only in marketing materials promoting luxury living for people who could afford to erase history. The irony that Tyler was using our past to justify destroying our legacy seemed lost on him entirely. As they bundled into their coats after dinner, Tyler lingered in the foyer the way he had at Thanksgiving, but this time his parting words carried the weight of an ultimatum disguised as concern. "Just think about it, Grams. Really think about what's best for everyone. We love you too much to watch you struggle with something you don't have to handle alone." The front door closed behind them with a finality that echoed through the empty house like a death knell, leaving me alone with the scattered blueprints of my dismantled life and the growing certainty that love, in their vocabulary, had been redefined to mean something I no longer recognized. Ruth answered on the second ring despite the late hour, her voice alert and concerned in the way of someone who'd been expecting bad news. "Beatrice? What's happened?" "They want to put me away, Ruth," I said without preamble, my voice steadier than I'd expected in the darkness of my kitchen. "Conservatorship, assisted living, the whole 9 yards. And they want to sell the house to developers." The silence that followed stretched long enough for me to hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking time with the persistence of truth itself. When Ruth finally spoke, her lawyer's composure had been replaced by something fiercer and more personal. "Tell me everything," she said, and I did. The recordings, the emails, the Christmas dinner presentation that had felt more like a corporate takeover than a family gathering. Ruth listened without interruption, occasionally making small sounds of disgust that told me my instincts about the severity of the situation had been accurate. "Beatrice," she said when I'd finished, "what they're planning is legal under certain circumstances, but it's also preventable if we move quickly. The conservatorship angle is their weakest link. You'd need to be declared incompetent by a court, and I can provide expert witnesses who would testify that you're sharper than people half your age. But even if we fight them off, they'll keep circling like vultures," I said, exhaustion suddenly weighing on me like a physical force. "Tyler's living here, Marcus controls the family narrative, and Lila's probably already researching which judges are most sympathetic to concerned family members." Ruth's laugh was low and dark, carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this conversation. "Actually, there's something we discussed a few years ago that might be perfect for this situation. Do you remember talking about heritage preservation?" I remembered vaguely, something about tax benefits and historical designations that had seemed too complicated to consider seriously at the time. "Refresh my memory." "We can establish a conservation easement that protects the property from development in perpetuity. Better yet, we can create a charitable trust that allows you to remain in the house for your lifetime while ensuring it becomes a historical site afterward. The tax benefits alone would be substantial, but the real beauty is that it makes the property worthless to developers." The implications began to dawn on me like sunrise after the longest night of winter. They couldn't sell it for condos? They couldn't sell it for a parking lot. The property would be protected forever, and the trust structure would make their conservatorship plans pointless. Hard to claim someone's incompetent when they've just made one of the smartest financial decisions of their life. Ruth's voice warmed with professional satisfaction. "Sometimes, Beatrice, the best revenge is living well." But sometimes it's living well while making it impossible for the bastards to profit from your death. For the first time in weeks, I found myself smiling in the darkness. Tyler stumbled downstairs at noon, his hair sticking up in directions that defied both gravity and good grooming, wearing the same clothes he'd collapsed in the night before after what I assumed was another networking session at Murphy's Tavern. The smell of stale beer and regret clung to him like cologne as he shuffled into my kitchen, squinting against the winter sunlight that streamed through windows he'd suggested were too old-fashioned for modern living. "Morning, Grams," he mumbled, though afternoon was already claiming territory on the grandfather clock in the hallway. His voice carried the rough edge of someone who'd spent too many hours justifying poor decisions to himself and anyone who'd listen. "You got any of that strong coffee?" I poured him a mug from the pot I'd brewed hours earlier, black as his mood and twice as bitter, setting it down on the formica table that had witnessed 1,000 conversations but none quite like the one we were about to have. The kitchen felt different this morning, charged with the electricity that comes before storms, when the air pressure drops and every living thing instinctively knows to seek shelter. While Tyler fumbled for sugar packets with hands that trembled slightly, I retrieved the manila folder from the counter where I'd placed it with the precision of a chess player positioning pieces for checkmate. The deed lay on top, its legal language crisp and unforgiving in the fluorescent light that Tyler had complained made everything look institutional. Beneath it, the trust documents Ruth had expedited through her network of legal contacts, their signatures still wet enough to catch the light. And underneath everything, the small digital recorder that had captured more truth than anyone in my family had spoken aloud in months. "Tyler," I said, settling into the chair across from him with the careful deliberation of someone who understood that words, once spoken, could never be recalled. "We need to talk about the house." He froze with his coffee mug halfway to his lips, and I watched something flicker behind his bloodshot eyes, calculation masquerading as concern, the same expression he'd worn as a child when caught with his hand in the cookie jar. But this wasn't about stolen cookies anymore. This was about stolen lives, stolen dignity, and the assumption that love could be measured in real estate appraisals. "What about it, Grams?" His voice carried forced casualness, the tone of someone who'd rehearsed innocence but hadn't quite perfected the performance. "You feeling okay? You know Dad and Mom and I are just worried about you rattling around in here all by yourself." Rattling around. The phrase had become their favorite, as if my presence in the house I'd called home for 52 years was somehow an inconvenience to be solved rather than a life to be respected. They'd reduced me to a marble in a tin can, something loose and bothersome that needed to be contained or discarded for the greater good of their financial planning. "Am I?" I asked, opening the folder with movements as precise as a surgeon making the first incision. "Rattling around, I mean. Or am I exactly where I'm supposed to be?" The deed lay between us on the table like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge, its official seals and notarized signatures catching the morning light that Tyler claimed was too harsh for aging eyes. His gaze fixed on the document with the intensity of someone trying to decode a foreign language, and I watched understanding dawn across his features like sunrise over a landscape he'd never bothered to map. Tyler's eyes widened as they tracked across the legal description, his lips moving silently as he processed words that apparently weren't computing with the narrative he'd constructed in his head. "What?" "Grams, this is from 1973. Dad said you guys had a mortgage until. Your father was 9 years old when Harold and I signed those papers," I said, my voice steady as the tick of time itself. "He doesn't know half of what he thinks he knows about this property, and apparently neither do you." I tapped the document with one finger, the same finger that had signed my name beside Harold's all those decades ago when we were young and foolish enough to believe that hard work and honest love were guarantees against the kind of betrayal that comes from your own bloodline. "Look closer, Tyler. Read the names. Beatrice Murphy Harlan and Harold James Harlan, fee simple absolute. No cosigners, no joint ownership with your father, no provision for inheritance distribution. Just Harold and me, and now just me." The words felt like a benediction and a curse all at once, the legal language that had once represented hope now serving as armor against the very family it was meant to protect. Tyler's hand shook as he reached for the deed, his hangover forgotten in the face of implications that were rewriting everything he'd assumed about his place in the family hierarchy. But the mortgage, Dad always said, was paid off in 1987, 2 years ahead of schedule. I pulled out the mortgage satisfaction document, its official stamps declaring our debt null and void in language that brooked no argument. Harold's furniture business was better than anyone realized, and his Aunt Millicent left us enough to make the final payment. We celebrated with a bottle of champagne that cost more than our weekly grocery budget. The color drained from Tyler's face as he shuffled through the papers, each document another nail in the coffin of his assumptions. Bank statements showing accounts he'd never known existed, investment portfolios that had grown quietly while he'd been calculating the value of assets he'd never owned, property assessments that placed the Victorian's worth at figures that made his development schemes look like child's play. You. Grems, why didn't you tell us? All this time, we thought. He stopped mid-sentence, perhaps realizing that admitting what he'd thought would be tantamount to confessing what he'd planned. What did you think, Tyler? My voice carried the gentle steel that Harold had always said could cut through nonsense better than any blade. That I was a helpless old woman sitting on property I didn't understand? That I needed my family to rescue me from my own incompetence? He had the grace to flush red, his eyes dropping to his coffee mug as if the answer might be floating in the dark liquid. It's not like that, Grams. We love you. We just want what's best. For whom? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Best for me? Or best for your bank account? Because I've seen your browser history, Tyler. I know about Richard Clemens and his expertise in family asset protection. I know about the conservatorship proceedings you've been researching and the photographs you've been taking to document my supposed incompetence. His coffee mug hit the table with enough force to slosh liquid onto the deed, and I watched him scramble to protect documents he was only now beginning to understand he had no claim to. You went through my computer? You left it open in my house while planning to have me declared mentally unfit. I'd say that makes us even, except that I'm not the one plotting to steal everything my family has worked for. I reached for the small recorder, my thumb hovering over the play button like a judge preparing to read a verdict. Would you like to hear what you really think of your loving grandmother? Because I have your own words, Tyler. Every scheming conversation, every calculated lie, every moment you thought you were outsmarting the senile old woman who was kind enough to give you shelter when no one else would. The blood drained from his face completely now, leaving him pale as January snow, and I understood that we had finally arrived at the moment of truth that had been building since that first casual comment about me being too old for my own home. I pulled out the trust documents with the deliberate ceremony of someone unveiling a masterpiece, their crisp legal language still carrying the faint scent of fresh ink and shattered assumptions. This is what I've been working on while you've been plotting my downfall, Tyler. The Harlan Family Heritage Trust, established last week with Ruth Davidson's help and filed with the county recorder yesterday morning. Tyler's eyes scanned the documents with growing horror, his hangover pallor deepening to something approaching green as he processed the implications. A heritage trust? What the hell does that mean? It means this property is now protected in perpetuity, I said, savoring each word like fine wine. No development, no subdivision, no condominiums where my apple orchard used to grow. The Victorian stays exactly as Harold and I made it, and the land stays exactly as God intended it. Forever. His hands trembled as he flipped through pages that were systematically destroying his financial future one clause at a time. You can't do this. This is our inheritance. Dad's inheritance. You're stealing from your own family. Inheritance? I laughed, and the sound surprised me with its genuine mirth. Tyler, you have to earn an inheritance through love, respect, and loyalty. You can't scheme your way into it like a corporate takeover. And the beauty of this trust is that it specifies exactly what happens to the property after I'm gone. I leaned forward, watching his face as I delivered the coup de grace. The Willow Creek Women's Shelter. Every penny from the trust's assets goes to helping women who've been pushed out of their homes by family members who thought they were too old, too weak, or too stupid to protect what they'd built. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Tyler's face crumpled as understanding hit him like a physical blow. You're giving away millions of dollars to strangers instead of your own family? I'm giving away millions of dollars to women whose families treated them exactly the way mine has treated me, I corrected. Women whose children decided that love could be measured in square footage and whose grandchildren thought manipulation was an acceptable substitute for affection. Tyler lurched to his feet, his chair scraping against the linoleum with a sound like fingernails on chalkboard. This is insane. You can't punish Dad and Mom and me because you're having some kind of breakdown. We were trying to help you. Help me? The words tasted bitter as burnt coffee. Tyler, helping someone means asking what they need and respecting their answer. What you were planning was theft dressed up as concern, greed masquerading as love. He began pacing the small kitchen like a caged animal, his hands raking through his hair in frustration. There has to be a way to contest this. Courts don't let people give away family fortunes to charities on a whim. You're right, I agreed pleasantly. Courts are very careful about protecting the rights of competent adults to make their own financial decisions. Fortunately, Ruth included a comprehensive mental competency evaluation in the trust documentation. Turns out I'm sharper than most people half my age, according to the neuropsychologist who tested me last week. The fight went out of him like air from a punctured balloon, leaving him standing in my kitchen looking exactly like what he was, a young man who'd gambled everything on assumptions that had just proven catastrophically wrong. I pressed play on the recorder, and Tyler's own voice filled the kitchen with the clarity of truth finally given its due. The conversation with Lila came first, his words carrying across the speaker with devastating precision. Yeah, Mom, she's definitely slipping. Forgets where she puts her keys, gets confused about dates. Dr. Morrison thinks a cognitive evaluation would be appropriate. Tyler's face went white as his own lies echoed back at him. Grams, I can explain. Explain what? How you've been manufacturing evidence of dementia that doesn't exist. How you've been lying to your parents about conversations with my doctor that never happened. I let the recording continue, Lila's voice joining the symphony of betrayal. Poor Beatrice. It's so sad watching someone deteriorate like that. But Tyler, you're being so responsible, protecting her from herself. The next conversation was with Marcus, his voice carrying the cold authority of a man accustomed to closing deals regardless of the human cost. Just get the deed, son. Once we establish conservatorship, the rest is paperwork. Real estate market's hot, we'd be fools not to capitalize. Get her into a facility, sell to developers, split it 3 ways. Everyone wins. Tyler had collapsed back into his chair, his head in his hands as his own voice condemned him with every word. She'll thank us eventually, came Marcus's recorded voice, followed by Tyler's nervous laugh in agreement. Yeah, professional care, no more worrying about bills. It's really the kindest thing. But it was Lila's voice that delivered the killing blow, her words dripping with casual cruelty. Just make sure the old bat doesn't sign anything before we can move. Poor thing probably doesn't understand half of what's happening anyway. Old bat. The phrase hung in the air like a curse, and I watched Tyler flinch as if he'd been physically struck. These were the people he'd allied himself with, the voices he'd chosen to listen to instead of the grandmother who'd loved him unconditionally until he'd taught her that unconditional love was just another exploitable weakness. Turn it off, Tyler whispered, his voice broken. Please, Grams, just turn it off. I stopped the recording, but the silence that followed was somehow worse than the cruel words that had preceded it. In that quiet kitchen, with winter sunlight streaming through windows I was supposedly too old to appreciate, my grandson finally understood the magnitude of what he'd lost through his own greed and calculation. These recordings go to the district attorney if you or your parents attempt any legal action against me or this trust, I said quietly. Elder abuse is a felony in New York State, Tyler. Even attempted elder abuse. Even elder abuse that fails because the intended victim was smarter than the perpetrators assumed. Tyler's departure from my house felt like watching a fever break, painful but ultimately cleansing. He packed his belongings with the mechanical efficiency of someone in shock, stuffing clothes into garbage bags and milk crates with none of the careful organization that had characterized his arrival 18 months earlier. The gaming setup that was supposed to launch his streaming career got disassembled with particular violence, cables yanked from walls and components shoved into boxes with the carelessness of someone who no longer believed in digital dreams. "This isn't over, Grams," he said from the doorway of what had been his temporary sanctuary, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder like a defeated soldier's pack. "Dad's not going to let you throw away the family fortune on some crazy charity scheme. You'll hear from lawyers." I stood in the kitchen doorway, watching him load his borrowed life into the beat-up Honda that had been parked in Harold's spot for so long I'd almost forgotten what the driveway looked like empty. "I'm sure I will," I replied, my voice steady as bedrock. "And they'll hear from Ruth Davidson, who specializes in exactly this kind of family dispute. Good luck, Tyler." The finality in my tone seemed to hit him like a physical blow. For just a moment, his composed facade cracked, and I saw the frightened boy who used to run to me when thunderstorms rattled the windows. "Grams, please. Can't we work this out? I made mistakes, but we're family." Family. The word that had once been my North Star now felt like a weapon turned against itself. "Yes, Tyler, we are family. And family doesn't plot to have each other declared incompetent for financial gain. Family doesn't lie to doctors or manufacture evidence of dementia. Family doesn't call their grandmother an old bat who doesn't understand what's happening to her own life." He climbed into his car without another word, and I watched him drive away from the kitchen window, the same window where I'd watched him arrive with hope in his eyes and promises on his lips. The irony wasn't lost on me that the boy who'd accused me of rattling around in an empty house was now truly alone, while I remained exactly where I belonged. Marcus called within an hour, his voice carrying the cold fury of a man whose carefully laid plans had just detonated in his face. "Mom, what the hell do you think you're doing? Tyler told me about this trust nonsense. You can't just give away everything Dad worked for." "Everything your father worked for is exactly what I'm protecting," I said, cradling the phone against my ear while watching snow fall outside the window Tyler had claimed was too drafty for modern living. Harold built this place as a home, not as an investment portfolio waiting to be liquidated by his grandchildren. This is financial suicide, Mom. You're going to end up broke and homeless while strangers profit from Dad's legacy. His voice carried the patronizing tone I'd heard him use with difficult clients, as if volume and authority could overcome the inconvenient reality of legal documents. Your father's legacy isn't money, Marcus. It's love, hard work, and the understanding that some things matter more than profit margins. Apparently, those are lessons that skipped a generation. The conversation devolved into threats about mental competency hearings and undue influence claims, but Marcus's bluster couldn't change the fundamental facts that Ruth had helped me establish. The trust was ironclad, my mental capacity was documented, and the recordings of their conspiracy would make any legal challenge a public relations nightmare they couldn't afford. Lila's response came via text message, a barrage of crying face emojis followed by passive-aggressive accusations about senior moments and confusion about complex financial matters. When those failed to generate a response, she escalated to social media posts about protecting elderly family members from themselves and the tragedy of dementia affecting good people. I blocked her number and her social media accounts with the same finality I'd used to sign the trust documents, cutting off her access to my emotional real estate as decisively as I'd protected my physical property. The house felt different that evening, not empty, but purified somehow, as if a toxic presence had been drawn out like poison from a wound. Ruth's network of historical preservation specialists descended on the property like scholarly archaeologists, their enthusiasm for Victorian architecture matching my own protective instincts. Dr. Elena Martinez from the State Historic Preservation Office walked through each room with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral, her fingers tracing original woodwork and crown molding with professional appreciation. "This is extraordinary, Mrs. Harlan," she said, her voice hushed as we stood in the front parlor where Harold had proposed 54 years earlier. "The integrity of the original details, the quality of your restoration work, this house is a textbook example of 1880s residential architecture. The National Register listing will be expedited." The paperwork moved with surprising efficiency through bureaucratic channels that usually ground forward at glacial pace. Ruth had explained that heritage preservation projects involving charitable trusts receive priority consideration, especially when they included provisions for public access and educational programming. Within 3 weeks, the Victorian carried federal protection status that made it more legally secure than Fort Knox. Meanwhile, contractors began converting the carriage house into what Ruth diplomatically called my downsizing residence. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was voluntarily moving into exactly the kind of smaller space that Tyler had been trying to force me into, but on my own terms and my own timeline. The carriage house had good bones. Harold had used it as his workshop for decades, and with some creative renovation, it became a cozy retreat that still allowed me to oversee the main house's transformation. The women's shelter renovations required more delicate work, preserving the Victorians' historical character while adding modern safety features and accessibility accommodations. Ruth had connected me with Sanctuary Architects, a firm specializing in converting historic properties into supportive housing. Their plans maintained the house's gracious proportions while creating 5 private suites, a commercial kitchen, and common areas that felt more like a stately home than an institutional facility. "The goal is dignity," explained Sarah Chin, the project's lead architect, as we reviewed blueprints spread across my dining room table. "Women who've lost their homes shouldn't have to sacrifice their sense of beauty and comfort. This house was built to nurture families, now it'll nurture chosen families of women supporting each other." The financial aspects proved as smooth as the architectural ones. The trust structure allowed for tax-deductible donations that attracted local businesses eager to support the project while reducing their own tax burdens. The regional bank that had once held our mortgage contributed professional services, the lumberyard where Harold had bought materials for decades donated hardwood flooring, and even the local newspaper pledged ongoing coverage to help with fundraising efforts.
By spring, the main house buzzed with purposeful activity. Carpenters restoring window sashes, electricians updating systems to modern standards, and gardeners preparing the grounds for therapeutic outdoor spaces where residents could find peace among Harold's apple trees. Marcus arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning in February, bringing with him a briefcase full of legal documents and a lawyer whose expensive suit looked out of place in my country kitchen. Richard Brennan, Esquire, specialized in what he euphemistically called family wealth protection, and he spread his paperwork across my table with the confidence of someone who'd bulldozed through opposition before. "Mrs. Harlan," Brennan began, his voice carrying practiced sympathy, "your son is concerned about some recent financial decisions that may not reflect your best interests. We're here to discuss options that would protect both your welfare and your family's legitimate expectations." Ruth arrived within 20 minutes of my phone call, her own briefcase containing documents that made Brennan's threats look like kindergarten finger painting. The mental competency evaluation, the trust documentation, the recordings of family conversations, and a letter from the district attorney's office indicating interest in potential elder abuse charges. Each item landed on the table like artillery shells in a war Brennan quickly realized he couldn't win. "My client's cognitive function tests in the 95th percentile for her age group," Ruth said pleasantly, sliding the neuropsychologist's report across to Brennan. "Her financial decisions demonstrate sophisticated understanding of tax law, estate planning, and charitable giving strategies. Any attempt to challenge her competency would require explaining why your clients were secretly recording conversations about having her committed while researching elder abuse loopholes." Marcus left without saying goodbye, his lawyer trailing behind like a defeated general retreating from an unwinnable battlefield. That evening, I received a terse email indicating that the family was respecting my wishes regarding the property, Legal speak for complete surrender dressed up as magnanimous gesture. Tyler vanished into the city's anonymity, his social media accounts going dark and his phone calls ceasing entirely. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned he'd found work at a telemarketing firm and was sharing an apartment with 3 other men his age, all of them struggling with the gap between their expectations and reality. Part of me wanted to reach out, to offer the olive branch that grandmothers are supposed to extend, but a larger part understood that some lessons could only be learned through consequences. Lila's social media campaign proved spectacularly counterproductive. Her posts about tragic family situations and elderly relatives making poor decisions generated responses from friends and acquaintances who'd seen the local newspaper coverage of the Heritage Preservation Project. Comment sections filled with praise for my inspiring generosity and criticism of family members who obviously just wanted to inherit money. Within a month, she deleted most of the posts and blocked everyone who disagreed with her narrative. The legal threats evaporated like morning mist under sunlight, leaving behind only silence and the growing realization that my family's claims on my property had always been built on assumptions rather than law. The Willow Creek Gazette ran the Heritage Preservation story on its front page, complete with historical photographs of the Victorian from the town archives and a detailed explanation of how the women's shelter would operate. Editor-in-Chief Margaret Sullivan had known Harold and me since we'd moved to town, and her article captured both the historical significance of the preservation and the human impact of the shelter project. Beatrice Harlan's gift to our community extends far beyond real estate, Sullivan wrote. She's preserving our architectural heritage while creating a sanctuary for women who need support during difficult transitions. This is what true community leadership looks like. The response was immediate and overwhelming. My mailbox filled with handwritten notes from neighbors expressing support and offering volunteer services. Helen Morrison, whose husband had worked alongside Harold at the mill, organized a phone tree to coordinate meal deliveries during the construction phase. The United Methodist Church voted to provide furniture donations, while the Rotary Club pledged funds for landscaping the therapeutic gardens. Even people I barely knew stopped me at the grocery store to express admiration for what they called my brave decision. Mrs. Patterson from the hardware store clasped my hands between hers and said, "You're showing everyone that getting older doesn't mean getting pushed around." My own daughter's been making noises about me selling my place. Might be time to have a conversation about expectations. The Historical Society invited me to speak at their monthly meeting about preservation strategies, and I found myself standing before a packed room of people who understood that protecting the past wasn't about sentimentality. It was about maintaining the foundations that give communities their character and identity. Houses like mine aren't just buildings, I told the assembled historians and preservationists. They're repositories of memory, anchors that keep communities connected to their roots even as everything else changes around them. Local television picked up the story when construction began, sending a young reporter who seemed genuinely moved by the project's combination of historical preservation and social service. The segment aired during the evening news with the headline "Victorian Values: How One Woman's Stand Preserves Past and Future," and generated calls from other communities interested in similar projects. Most gratifying were the responses from women who'd heard about the shelter and wanted to contribute their skills. A retired nurse volunteered to help residents navigate healthcare systems, a social worker offered trauma counseling services, and a local chef proposed teaching cooking classes that would help women develop both practical skills and social connections. By summer, the project had become a symbol of how individual courage could catalyze community transformation, turning what might have been a family dispute into a model for preserving both architectural heritage and human dignity. The first 5 women arrived on a crisp October morning when the apple trees hung heavy with fruit and the Victorians' windows caught the autumn light like promises finally kept. Each carried her story in the careful way women learn to transport pain, quietly, efficiently, with dignity that refused to acknowledge how much weight she bore. Delphine Morrison came first, a firecracker of a woman whose husband had gambled away their dairy farm and poker games that lasted longer than their 30-year marriage. Her laugh could shatter glass or heal hearts, depending on the circumstances, and she claimed the front bedroom with its view of the apple orchard because trees don't lie to you about loving you forever then bet you away on a pair of sevens. Clara Whitfield arrived with nothing but a suitcase and a lifetime of silence imposed by a son who decided his inheritance was more important than his mother's independence. She was drawn to the kitchen garden Harold had planted, kneeling in the soil with hands that remembered growing things even when her heart had forgotten hope. The others, Margaret, Sarah, and Elena, brought their own collections of betrayals and beginnings, filling the Victorians' rooms with the particular energy of women who'd survived abandonment and chosen reconstruction over surrender. They moved through Harold's and my home with reverence, understanding instinctively that they were custodians of both architectural history and their own emerging futures. The apple orchard became their sanctuary, its gnarled branches offering shade for afternoon conversations that ranged from practical matters like healthcare navigation to philosophical discussions about the difference between family and blood relations. I watched them from my carriage house window, tending both trees and each other with the patience that trauma survivors learn to cultivate, careful growth after careful growth, until trust becomes possible again. Within weeks, the Victorian hummed with purposeful life that felt more vibrant than it had in decades, as if the house itself was finally fulfilling its deepest intention to shelter and nurture those who needed protection most. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday in November, my name written in the careful script Tyler had learned in elementary school, when penmanship still mattered. Inside, 2 documents: a formal letter from Richard Clemens withdrawing all legal challenges to the trust, and a single sheet of notebook paper covered in handwriting that looked like it had been started and restarted multiple times. Grams. It began. I get it now. Roots aren't for sale. I spent these months thinking you'd stolen my future, but I was the one stealing from you, from the house, from what Grandpa Harold built with his own hands. I was so busy calculating square footage that I forgot to measure love. The letter continued with details of his life in the city, the shared apartment, the telemarketing job, the slow recognition that respect couldn't be inherited but had to be earned through choices made daily. I know I have no right to ask this, he concluded, but could I visit sometime? No agenda, no schemes. Just a grandson who wants to learn how to be worthy of the grandmother who raised him right the first time. I read it twice before folding it carefully and placing it in Harold's desk drawer, next to the deed and the trust documents that had rewritten our family's future. Visit? Perhaps. But on new terms with new understanding, and only if he truly meant what he'd written about roots running deeper than real estate values. From my carriage house window, I watched evening light paint the Victorians' clapboard siding gold, her rooms glowing with the warm illumination of women who'd learned that home wasn't something you inherited, but something you created through daily acts of courage and care. The apple trees rustled in the November wind, their bare branches reaching towards stars that Harold used to point out during our evening walks around the property we'd loved into abundance. Too old for this house? Tyler's words echoed in my memory, but they'd lost their sting somewhere between betrayal and redemption, between the moment I'd signed away his assumptions and the moment I'd signed into my true purpose. The Victorian had weathered storms for more than a century, and now she was sheltering the next generation of survivors who understood that strength wasn't measured in years, but in the willingness to begin again. I smiled in the darkness, thinking of Tyler's careful handwriting and the possibility of forgiveness that came without guarantees. The house creaked softly in the wind, her timbers settling into another night of purposeful rest. Too old for the house? No, boy. The house was just getting started, and so was I. Thank you for joining me on this journey of resilience and redemption. If you enjoyed Beatrice's story of courage in the face of family betrayal, please like and subscribe to Voices of Rosa. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I'd love to know how far these stories of strength and dignity have traveled. Until next time, remember that home isn't where you're from, but where you choose to make your stand.